Hello, everyone. We are going to get started with the second part of the Red Power American Indian Power Movement. And I'm sharing my screen so I can show the presentation. Okay, so for part two, we are going to jump right into the doctrine of discovery. So, to summarize the document of discovery, this has been not only the official policy of the United States since 1823, so we have to understand that this is 1776 is the successful conclusion of the Revolutionary War from the United States perspective, in which the initial 13 English colonies um, wrested sovereignty from England and then continue to maintain and perpetuate and expand a very colonialist, white supremacist, and what we would now call imperialist, right, government. And so while Doctrine of Discovery had been in place for some time and enacted by European powers, specifically England, it is important to note that the U.S. Supreme Court concretized it and codified doctrine of discovery, quote unquote, into law in a ruling in Johnson versus McIntosh. And so this is really critical because, and this is an example of actually what critical race theory is, because critical race theory simply examines the codification or the formalized institutionalization of systemic discrimination and oppression into law. So, in order to actually study critical race theory, not only would an individual need to choose to attend a PhD program in law school beyond normal law school, where you leave being awarded a JD or Juris Prudence, a Juris Doctorate in law, but a PhD is taking it a step further in for those who choose to engage in extremely scholarly, higher level study of law, then you would need to choose to specialize in CRT, critical race theory, or what's called CRIT. And this is an example of Native American, US based, or Indigenous Studies CRIT. And so, in a nutshell, doctrine of discovery is very circular. It's simply, and it creates this narrative and this rhetoric that is made up like any other form of pseudoscience or social Darwinism, to justify just wholesale, ongoing theft of land and resources and human beings by asserting that Native Americans, this is only applicable to US, the United States. So it's important to note people native to Turtle Island, because the Americas, there's more than just one America. It's important to note that doctrine of discovery was not codified into law into Canada, in the Western Hemisphere, or in south of the US border or in the Caribbean. So that's why it matters. The specificity matters. We have to understand how different nation states that are all at this point colonialist um, nations in the Western Hemisphere, they're not indigenous, right? In terms of the main powers or the even though reservations are recognized as being sovereign from the US, they're still not truly independent nations or countries in the same way as Canada, the US, the countries in the Caribbean, Mexico, Central, South America. So basically, in Johnson versus McIntosh, it ruled that the those native to Turtle Island's failure to bow down, to give in, to willingly capitulate and surrender to conquest of the land, possession and coercion and enslavement was their fault. And so this is a similar logic if we look at the US classifying enslaved peoples of African descent up until 1865 as chattel or property. It literally means property. And this extreme form of enslavement was not even practiced throughout universally during the transatlantic slave era from the 1500s to 1888, if we count Brazil. They were the last country to formally abolish slave enslavement. And so enslaved peoples, when they attempted to liberate, and when they did successfully liberate themselves, were diagnosed with a made-up mental illness called drapetomania. They were characterized as being insane because they were stealing property, which is how the U.S. government framed and institutions framed and criminalized liberating oneself from enslavement. So, and it was considered a crime for a person who was involuntarily enslaved, forcibly enslaved, to try to liberate themselves. And when they did successfully liberate themselves, they were they were technically stealing property. I mean, it's wild. And you can see this same through line when it comes to the narrative and the rhetoric and the justification of doctrine and discovery. At the time, Chief Justice John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, actually supported the belief that those native or indigenous to Turtle Island lost their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations upon discovery by Europeans, quote unquote. This is from the doctrine from the case itself. So basically, it simply said because Europeans decide over the course of hundreds of years, enacting really the first widespread case of biological warfare intentionally, um, etc., were right. Might makes right. So this is what the doctrine of discovery is. So we can see the kind of the entitlement and the justification, and how this is not sustainable. I mean, it's wild, but this is what it is. We're going to forward wind to another example of critical race theory, and native or indigenous crits is where it would kind of the sub specialization of critical race theory of looking at codified, institutionalized, legalized discrimination, which unfortunately has been back in the US at the highest levels, at the Supreme Court level, all kinds of legalized discrimination against transgender people, against anyone speaking with an accent, right, an accent that is deemed not American, that is deemed anyone who, based on how they look in terms of who can be detained by ICE. And now, of course, based on the complete gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1964, or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which will affect everyone. Um, so in 1956, we also have another instance of the Relocation Act, which specifically was framed in terms of um, removal. We already have the first longstanding and widespread removal and forced kidnapping and disappearing of children, not only in the US, but also in Canada, in Australia, for example, forcible kidnapping of Native children and Aboriginal children, Indigenous children, forcing them to boarding schools where all kinds of systemic harm was enacted, and cultural genocide, because cultural genocide, where they were forced to cut their hair, forced to wear Western garb, forced to not speak their language, forced to not practice their traditions and their religions, and they were beaten, they were sexually abused, and mass graves have been uncovered, right, not even that long ago, especially in the 21st century, in these places. And so the Relocation Act of 1956, while it was framed in terms of helping those native to Turtle Island to leave, now going from all of their ancestral land, which this continues to be their land. This is unceded land. Land cannot be owned. Private property ownership actually is a creation of colonization also as well. And so again, now we're going from forcing natives and quarantining them into reservations or reserves, depending on where you are in the world, where the colonization has happened, to now forcing them off of the reservations to job training centers in urban areas so that they can acquire um, skills, right? Except this was just warmed over, regurgitated strategy from a reservation in the era of colonization and reservation 100, 250 years prior to this, where the notion was kill the Indian, save the man. So what boarding schools did was it was stripping forcibly, violently, it's called deculturation, and forcing acculturation or acculturation is stripping away, but you can't totally strip away someone's culture. And assimilation, forced assimilation in terms of really training and educating Native children, not only on Turtle Island in the US, but elsewhere, to be second-class citizens, to be in permanent servitude to the colonizers of European descent, or as what became hardened white. Whiteness was the first category that was actually codified in the US Census, the very first census administered in 1790. So we see that over the colonial era, whiteness itself becomes the first racialized, legalized kind of construct. And it is solely created as stemming from all of this violence and all of this systemic legalized discrimination. So whiteness is not real. It doesn't exist. It does not come from Europe. And it is literally an incredibly violent social construct. It is set up as the other racialized constructs are to either be extremely oppressive or to be subjugated. And also, we can't forget socioeconomic status. And the reality is that there's a really, really, really intense investment in whiteness culturally, politically, even for those who do not benefit from it economically and in terms of their actual material conditions. There's still, and this, I'm not talking about folks who have are of European descent. I'm talking about anyone who subscribes to white supremacy in any way. And so again, melanin is only a protection against ultraviolet radiation from the sun. It is not a protection against ideology. So there are many people also who are subscribed to white supremacy who are not classified as white themselves. Really important to note that. Now, what's really so again, what happened is with the Relocation Act of 1956, natives were forcibly removed from their last remaining lands and pushed into very marginalized urban communities. So the unintended consequence of this act actually put natives who had been on reservations, plopped them down in the middle of urban centers all over the US, like Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, Detroit, you name it, right? And it put them in close proximity to African Americans at this point, well, Negroes in 1956. By the time we get to the Black Power movement, changing the name to Black, reclaiming that heritage, reclaiming and flipping the negative and stigmatized and intentionally demonized connotations of Blackness. Same with the Chicano Power movement, Chicano being a previously very pejorative, negative slur against someone of Mexican descent who was brown and who was deemed to be impoverished. So you're putting younger Native Americans, pushing them forcibly off of the reservations in order to still ghettoize them, in order to perpetuate and maintain a status of second-class citizenship upon them, and they come into contact with civil rights, with Black Power, with Chicano power activists, and with Asian American power activists. And so this is what lays the foundation for Native Americans who now have been urbanized for a generation. If we're going back to the reservations, connecting with older, more traditional elders to reclaim, like, because their parents had been subjected to boarding schools. And so there was so much violence and so much intentional ripping away of and also an onslaught of so many different kinds of abuses, physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, verbal. And so this is where we also see a really steep increase in rates of alcoholism, in rates of domestic violence, and in rates of suicide among US based natives. So it's really important to note that an unintended consequence is that now we get the foundation laid for the American Indian movement or the Red Power movement. We also have to understand that in addition to these laws, the treaties themselves, which were supposed to be agreements between the US government and sovereign nations, were actually a primary and longstanding way of colonizing and taking land from Native Americans because all of them were broken. So the social political context of the Red Power movement is that there's a little bit of a timeline from 1969 to 1971. We have Native AIM members, American Indian Movement occupying the island of Alcatraz, and Native Turtle Islanders from all tribes doing that right in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have national protests taking place against the Vietnam War. We also have the rise of Black Power and La Raza movements. And as the previous slide stated, we have the forcible removal of young Native Turtle Islanders from reservations so that now they're in proximity and increasingly in co-solidarity with these other social justice movements. And this solidarity also gets repeated at San Francisco State University in 1968 and 1969, where different student organizations come together to create ethnic studies as an academic discipline, the only academic discipline created by and for students. So the American Indian movement is, I'm going to give a brief kind of background. And again, looking at the primary source documentation, which is the historic firsthand experiences as depicted in photographs and video clips and by individuals who are still alive, right? Many of the activists from this movement are still alive, like Lynetta Jax, Warjax, who was the president of the Native American Student Organization at San Francisco State or at UC Berkeley, and who actually is the first Native woman to attain a doctorate from UC Berkeley. So in listening to this video, I want you to be thinking of these 7 questions in order to help guide you through the key information, the key takeaways that are very important. So the when did Native activists found the American Indian movement? The what, when, what, who, right, where, why. But we're doing when, what, who. When did Native Americans found the American Indian movement? What were some reasons that AIM was created? What was the phrase used when activists states that American Indians were about to be written out of history? Number 4, what was the average yearly income of Native Turtle Islanders at the founding of the American Indian movement? Number 5, what percentages of Native Turtle Islander houses didn't have electricity on reservations? I will tell you, I went to Dene Reservation in when I was a faculty member at Northern Arizona University in 2013, 2014. There was still no running water. Number 6, what was the educational attainment of Native Turtle Islander students at this time? And number 7, whose death activated the American Indian movement into action? So we will watch this video together. And I also want to share beforehand that in terms of these activists still being alive, many of them were very young. And AIM continued, right? It continued in various forms, even after the kind of pinnacle of the movement in the 70s. While I was a grad student completing my master's degree at Northern Arizona University, I, back in from 1997 to 2000, I became friends with Kurt Begay, very common Dene name or Navajo name, and he had been a name. He was a single father. He was probably in his 40s at this time, so he had been a member of AIM. So again, very young people are at the forefront of and often lead are integral to the most impactful and long-lasting social justice movements, not only in this country, but also around the world.
Right behind you, when you look back, the white man standing right there. Remember, he's a very dangerous man. He's waiting he's waiting for you to trip. And he's waiting to you to trip to assault the universe. That you are part of this nature. So you must walk. You must walk in a very sacred way. And these are very important. We never had two masters. We only have one master, grandfather. But since the United States government come to this Western Hemisphere, we have two masters. So we are confused who to believe, what to believe. But remember, we was born to be a red man. And we was born to be a nation.
So it's taking different kinds of footage and documents, again, very historic primary source documents. So on July 28th, 1968, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so you can see this is one of the urban areas where young Native Turtle Islanders were forced off of different reservations, and they were relocated to urban areas such as Minneapolis in 1956. So literally just 12 years later, you have the American Indian movement being born and being created um, by a lot of natives who had been forcibly relocated off of reservations. So this is when AIM was formally created.
And the reason for Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt to be part of the formation of the movement was they were in prison. And they saw the racism going on right in the prison. There was no religious freedom rights. And so I think they came out of the prison, the institutions, with a determination to change what they had experienced. And
I kind of chaired the first meeting, saying that we have to do something about the police brutality, about the slum housing conditions, high unemployment that we're in, and the more we talked, the more people started to ask questions. Then there was one guy out there in the audience who was saying, "Well, what kind of action are we going to do?" And I say, "Well, we've got to form a committee. We're sick of committees. Well, these committees don't do nothing." So everything that I was talking about was being challenged by this guy, and the guy, of course, I knew, and that was Clyde Belcourt. And he wanted action right now, and we said, "Okay, we're going to go do it tomorrow morning." Well, we said, "Well, maybe Monday we can go meet with the police." "No, we want to go tomorrow morning." So I said, "All right, who wants to go tomorrow morning?" So they formed people to go see the police chief right now.
We were all there at this meeting, and so we brought together, I guess, the summation of all our lives, all our experiences at a time when I always expressed it that we were about to be written out of history as roadkill cultures of manifest destiny.
It was called the Indian and White America. And the statistics that came out of the study was basically that Indians were living to be 44.5 years of age. That the average income on most reservations was between $1,500 and $2,000 a year. That unemployment on most reservations was as high as 80-90%. The housing, that I think at the time 40% of the American Indian housing didn't even have electricity nationally, and some reservations was higher than that. Dene Nation in particular, Navajo. The educational level of attainment for Indian students was 8.5 grades. So all these conditions were probably, and there was no question, they were the worst conditions in terms of social measurement of any ethnic group in America.
And at that time, when a white man killed an Indian, he was given manslaughter. When an Indian killed a white man, he was given first-degree murder. A form of frontier justice was going on that we knew we had to address.
How I came to know about the American Indian movement was we had a loss in our family. One of our grandpas, Raymond Yellow Thunder, was brutally murdered in Gordon, Nebraska. My mother, Grace Eagle Fox, her mother was Raymond's older sister. Her name was Annie Yellow Thunder. And that happened when he was murdered, and the family came to Dick Wilson, was a chairman, and for help into looking into the murder of our grandpa Raymond Yellow Thunder, but there was no help from there. They went on into the BIA to ask the superintendent and those in power at the BIA for help, but there was no help. And so a relative from Porcupine, Sievert Young Bear Sr., the family contacted him, and he had found out that American Indian movement was meeting in Nebraska. I don't know if it was Omaha or Lincoln, but they were having a national meeting there. So they sent Sievert Young Bear as a runner from the Yellow Thunder family to go to Omaha to ask AIM to come and look into the death of Raymond, and they wanted something to happen and to shake up those officials in Gordon, Nebraska. So
the incident of Raymond Yellow Thunder's death, where he was an alcoholic in the streets of Gordon, Nebraska, and he couldn't defend himself when several rednecks got him isolated and started to beat up on him. Then they pushed him into a VFW hall and stripped him of his clothes and burnt him with cigarettes, and he was kind of forced to dance.
VFW stands for Veterans of Foreign Wars.
Then they took him out the back door and beat him up some more and threw him in the trunk of a car where he froze to death. I think that was when the elders, traditional people in Pine Ridge, called upon AIM to do something.
So again, the perpetrators of this horrific, violent, intentional murder were not charged with Capital One. They were charged with manslaughter, which actually comes with very light sentencing. So the next, we have to look at Wounded Knee Massacre from the 19th century to also understand the causes of one of the main protests, which was the standoff at Wounded Knee in 1973. Now, some of this is a little bit of review in terms of we know that AIM was launched in 1968. But again, we're going to look at the historic causes of the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was really notable. It was incredibly violent. It was a response to the Ghost Dance movement, was a movement in the latter part of the 19th century in which colonization and westward expansion was still occurring, and natives primarily all over their ancestral land, Turtle Island, were experiencing this revival of their spiritual pathways, or what we would call spiritual technologies. And the ghost dance was connecting directly with ancestors and spirit guardians of the land. Um, and really, it was about the spirit guardians of the different native nations, to bring back a way of being and living that will restore some dignity, some degree of true independence or self-determination or sovereignty, and also believed that there was a belief that it really has to do with the belief in the spirit over the incarnate flesh. It has to do with understanding that when we transition many peoples for thousands and thousands of years prior to the onset of Christianity. The big three, Islam or Judaism, have believed in an afterlife. This actually, the first culture and society that believed in the concept of an afterlife were the ancient Egyptian civilizations. And we can also trace this back to many pre-Christian, pre-colonizing indigenous nations and societies, including on Europe itself. In Europe itself, we're talking about hundreds and thousands of years ago, where there was a belief in the interconnectedness of all life, or interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it, and a belief that we were more than simply flesh, and that our lives would continue even after we had transitioned out of the physical incarnate form. And so one of the beliefs that I believe was mistranslated and grossly misunderstood was that with the ghost dance, this revival movement of really indigenous, again, native to Turtle Island, spiritual technologies, beliefs, ways of being, religion, right, was that they were protected from bullets, from violence. And colonialist, white supremacist misconceptualizations and misunderstanding of this, like, oh, they thought they could be. No, it's like who they intrinsically are is far beyond the flesh and far beyond any violence that can be enacted against them. And that their civilizations and nations had endured for thousands of years prior to all of this violence and prior to colonization. Who they are, who everyone is in totality across the globe, is far more than the last 500-year periods. And that we can see, you're going to compare a civilization that has endured for thousands of years. United States is observing 250 years of existence. And even if we count the onset of colonization, it's already on the decline. So these are just observations. So we're going to hone in order to understand one of the most pivotal protests and standoffs that would actually lead to the illegal political imprisonment of Leonard Peltier, who was actually recently released and not pardoned by Joe Biden before he left office, but at least because of health reasons and having been illegally, falsely accused of killing some FBI agents. It's a long story. But again, in order to understand Wounded Knee and the standoff at Wounded Knee, why it is so pivotal, why there have been films made about this, and even fictionalized versions of this, we must go back to the original Wounded Knee Massacre, which is simply, unfortunately, a demonstration and emblematic of this extreme violence enacted against Native people since the onset of the first colonizers stepping on the shores of Turtle Island. This kind of violence, in terms of mob violence, the most violent groups systemically in the United States in every way have been those who have enacted and activated white violence that stems directly from white privilege and white immunity. And we'll see that to this current day. And so there's been this generations and generations of extreme and violence enacted against any marginalized group in mass, right? Not just like what happened with the man who was viciously beaten and tortured and beaten some more. I mean, that, right? This is so we still see how much violence pervades and is such a hallmark of our culture, and especially of those who part of their understanding generation after generation after generation of being granted this kind of carte blanche or free will to just rampage. I mean, we see that now. We still see that. These instances of violence with very little or some, to accountability or justice and then people supporting that, right, violence. So again, epigenetically, what epigeneticists would assert is that this has been passed down in generations, many generations at this point, of people in the US in particular, especially when we're talking about white supremacy. So it's in the epigenetics. There's a sense of entitlement around enacting and unleashing this kind of violence. We can talk about patriarchy, right? We can talk about adults, abuse of children, like whatever groups have been really inculcated in not true power, but an extreme abuse of power. There's discrimination that is systemic and that goes beyond laws, it goes beyond policies, it goes beyond, which is all forms of violence. The lack of education, the high mortality rate of Turtle Island Native peoples, all of the sickness, and then it also is in literal violence. And so it's pretty heavy, and it's important to understand the reason and the historic basis of Wounded Knee becoming emblematic of the kind of just unchecked violence enacted against indigenous peoples in Turtle Island. And the US government, actually, the only group that the US government had at one point a legalized policy of genociding a group of people by law is Turtle Island indigenous peoples. So as we watch this film, or this video, I want you to listen out for what was the purpose of the ghost dance. Number two, what were Native Turtle Islanders driven to after their land was taken forcibly? Yet it's still their land. 40,000 years versus 500. Nope. This is unceded land. And part of the atonement that needs to happen, and that will happen, and that is happening, is re-establishing the balance and the truth of who's ancestral, who are the stewards of this land, truly. I mean, that's why we see all of this incredible mismanagement and desecration and destruction of our natural resources. And people are counting out the land and the air and we can't. Climate change is a real thing, right? So that has to be factored in too. Nature always will seek equilibrium and seek to reestablish a balance. And the more skewed and distorted and imbalanced the relation to the land is, then the more extreme nature writ large will basically respond is simply about reestablishing a balance. Number three, why did the US government outlaw the ghost dance? And at this point, we have the Bill of Rights, we have the Second Amendment, which talks about religious freedom on paper. Number four, what did the US military do to a band of Lakota Sioux, vast majority of which were women and children? And then five, what year did this happen?
By the late 1880s, a message of hope spread across the Great Plains.
And so there is going to be some description of graphic violence, so I do want to warn you about that. And some images of the aftermath of the massacre. So I want to warn you about that.
It was called the Ghost Dance, a dance to restore the past when Indian nations were free.
They danced without rest, on and on. Occasionally, someone thoroughly exhausted and dizzy fell unconscious into the center and lay there dead. visions ended the same way, like a chorus describing a great encampment of all the Lakotas who had ever died, where there was no sorrow, but only joy, where relatives thronged out with happy laughter. The people went on and could not stop. And so I suppose the authorities did think they were crazy, but they weren't. They were only terribly unhappy.
Driven off their lands, Indian nations were confined to desolate reservations, dependent on corrupt government agencies for food and supplies.
The people were desperate from starvation. We felt that we were mocked in our misery. We held our dying children and felt their little bodies tremble as their souls went out and left only a dead weight in our hands. Red Cloud, Oglala.
The ghost dance hurt no one, but as it spread, white settlers panicked. The United States government
Colonizers, not settlers. Settler colonialism, so it's short for settler colonizers. Different from traditional colonization or colonialism.
outlawed the dance.
The white men were frightened and called for soldiers. We had begged for life, and the white men thought we wanted theirs.
On a mild day just after Christmas of 1890, a band of Hokwoju Sioux, under their leader Bigfoot, left the Cheyenne River Agency in South Dakota, heading for a meeting at Pine Ridge with Oglala leader Red Cloud. Traveling with Bigfoot were 106 men and 252 women and children. Among them was a boy, Dewey Beard, who would later tell his children and grandchildren about that day.
Grandpa Dewey Beard being the last survivor, I would listen to what he had to say. In a way, it was sad, and yet it's beautiful because it's bringing back history. One thing that he would say is that had the government left them alone, in time they would have looked outside and seen how things were changing, and the change would come about from within the bands.
Bigfoot's band was intercepted by the 7th Cavalry. The officer in charge found Bigfoot wrapped in heavy blankets, dying from pneumonia in the back of a wagon. Bigfoot was ordered to make camp along Wounded Knee Creek. In the morning, his people would be stripped of their weapons and escorted to Pine Ridge. Bigfoot made assurances of his peaceful intentions, and the band made camp.
He's a peaceful man. He's always say that think about the elderly, think about the children and the woman, and don't start the trouble.
Morning broke after a sleepless night surrounded by soldiers. Hokwoju witnesses would later recall what happened next.
Bigfoot, who was sick, came up with a flag of truce tied to a stick. Dewey Beard.
As soldiers trained their guns on them, Bigfoot and his men brought forth all their weapons, placing them near the white flag of truce Bigfoot had planted in front of his lodge. The soldiers then searched their tents and wagons for arms, even confiscating cooking and sewing tools. As Bigfoot's people gathered around the flag of truce outside his tent, 4 powerful Hotchkiss rapid-repeating guns were mounted above the camp.
I noticed that they were erecting cannons up here, also hauling up quite a lot of ammunition for it.
They encircled us like a band of sheep.
I could see that there was commotion amongst the soldiers, and I saw, on looking back, they had their guns in position, ready to fire.
Thomas Tibbles, a white reporter who followed the troops to Wounded Knee, recorded what happened next.
Suddenly I heard a single shot from the direction of the troops. Then 3 or 4, a few more. and immediately a volley. At once came a general rattle of rifle firing, then the Hotchkiss guns.
An awful noise was heard, and I was paralyzed for a time. Then my head cleared, and I saw nearly all the people on the ground, bleeding. My father, my mother, my grandmother, my older brother, and my younger brother were all killed.
And he saw his mother walking toward him. She was walking along, and she was shot. Dewey, she said, keep walking, my son. She said, keep going. She said, I'm going to die. And that was the last time he saw his mother.
The women, as they were fleeing with their babies, were killed together, shot right through. And after most of them had been killed, a cry was made that all those not killed or wounded should come forth, and they would be safe. Little boys came out of their places of refuge, and as soon as they came in sight, a number of soldiers surrounded them and butchered them there. American Horse, Oglala.
The firing continued for an hour or two, wherever a soldier saw a sign of life. With the sunset, the weather turned intensely cold. About 7 o'clock that night, the 7th Cavalry brought in the long train of dead and wounded soldiers and Indians from Wounded Knee. 49 wounded Sioux women and children had been piled into a few old wagons.
The wounded Indian women and children were eventually carried into an agency church, where they lay in silence on the floor beneath a pulpit decorated with a Christmas banner reading, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men."
Nothing I have seen in my whole life ever affected or depressed or haunted me like the scenes I saw that night in that church. One unwounded old woman held a baby on her lap. I handed a cup of water to the old woman, telling her, "Give it to the child," who grabbed it as if parched with thirst. As she swallowed it hurriedly, I saw it gush right out again. A blood-stained stream through a hole in her neck. Heartsick, I went to find the surgeon. For a moment, he stood there near the door, looking over the mass of suffering and dying women and children. Ah, the silence. The silence they kept was so complete, it was oppressive. And then to my amazement, I saw that the surgeon, who I knew had served in the Civil War attending the wounded from Wilderness to Appomattox, he began to grow pale. "This is the first time I've seen a lot of women and children shot to pieces," he said, "and I can't stand it." Thomas Tibbles, reporter.
For 3 days, the frozen bodies of the dead, including Bigfoot, lay where they fell at Wounded Knee. Finally, the Army dug a large trench at the massacre site. Then, as they collected the bodies, a blanket was seen moving. Beneath it, snuggled against her dead mother, was a baby girl.
So I touched briefly upon epigenetics. And in a nutshell, it's that we not only contain the genetic material, the chromosomes of our parents, but we also carry in our DNA whatever experiences of trauma and also of resilience, also of ingenuity, also of healing from as far as 7 to 14 generations of our ancestors in the past. And the price of this whole world's order since dating back to 1492, it is traumatic to perpetuate this kind of indescribable violence against not only other human beings, but any life form. That's traumatic. And while that may not be as well understood or grasped, to pass down and think about just so much violence. In 2026, we have a girls' school in Iran that is intentionally targeted by Israel and the United States. Iran gives warning. Iran and other countries do subscribe or attempt to the Geneva Convention. You do not target non-military bases, places that are not harboring weapons or military personnel. And this school was not bombed once, but twice intentionally. So to understand that this is absolutely the U.S., that this is absolutely the unintegrated collective shadow work of what this country is built on, and what is continuously perpetrated both domestically and abroad, that we cannot change what we refuse to acknowledge. There's a through line. And the reporter and the surgeon, they are retaining their humanity in the midst of this. It is those who perpetrate the harm who are epigenetically passing down to their descendants this sickness. It's a sickness. My ancestors called it Waniko, the Pamunkey. Other Native nations called it Watiko. It is a sickness. It is a psychosis. And it is when balance is so far askew. It's so far askew. So when I say epigenetics, I understand what it is. I understand what it's not. I'm not talking about a different kind of camouflaged pseudoscientific racism. I'm talking about our DNA interacts with the environment, and what gets passed down to us from our ancestors is not only the genetics, but also the different experiences that are encoded. Think about neural synaptic pathways. Our DNA, every part of us, is in constant interaction with the environment around us. It is nature and nurture. We have a through line where this kind of violence continues. And we have a through line where the resistance and the overcoming of this kind of violence continues. And it is essential that it start within each one of us to reckon with what has been passed down in our given families, in our given communities, in our society, and in the world. And how do we draw from the best of us, those intergenerational gifts and legacies, to work through and transform the intergenerational traumas that this so powerfully demonstrates. Now, to understand one of the key pivotal moments in AIM, the standoff at Wounded Knee, Lakota, on Pine Ridge Reservation, we're going to look at what was the purpose of the Trail of Broken Treaties, who were Oglala Sioux on the Pine Ridge Reservation opposing. White supremacy is an ideology. It's a conditioning. It's a programming. It has nothing to do with skin color. It has nothing to do with gender. It has nothing to do with socioeconomic status. It has nothing to do with religion, with nationality, with documentation status, with none of that. It has to do with, are we colonized in our minds, or are we actively decolonizing our minds? This is going to really be very important for question number 3 that's going to guide us through this video. Number 4, when did AIM go back full circle and take over Wounded Knee? They were completing a medicine wheel. They were completing a circle to unapologetically and unequivocally mend the harm that had been enacted to the best of their ability. Because once we are taken out of here, whichever way we go, we become ancestors. So they were reclaiming and redeeming their ancestors. Number 5, what were the goals set by AIM leaders? This is a pivotal protest, and you cannot understand it unless you understand the massacre that took place at Wounded Knee.
Wounded Knee, 1973. Prequel. The 1960s were a troubled time in U.S. history. The war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement marked the decade, along with great music. In the midst of all the social happenings, the American Indian movement originated in 1968, arising from the concerns of Native Americans in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Shortly, the AIM. The movement focused on changing the life of Native Americans in the urban environment, addressing poverty, lack of political representation, discrimination, and police brutality. Members coordinated a neighborhood patrol to circumvent unjust arrests and police mishandling of Native residents. Clyde Bellecourt and Dennis Banks, Chippewa from Minnesota, assisted in the creation of AIM. Later, Russell Means, an Oglala Sioux, became one of the more aggressive leaders of the organization. The AIM members sponsored the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972. Approximately 900 people traveling from Seattle and San Francisco stopped at reservations throughout the West to point out Native grievances toward the U.S. government. The trail ended in Washington, D.C., with the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building from November 2nd through November 8th, 1972. Negotiations between the White House administrators and AIM members resulted in an agreement that included a pledge to deal with economic, social, and educational injustice of Native Americans and to provide return travel money. Following the death of Raymond Yellow Thunder in February of 1972 in Gordon, Nebraska, the AIM took over Gordon Community Hall. Leaders declared a victory after local officials proposed the establishment of a Human Relations Board to investigate grievances. Just 1 month before the Wounded Knee siege.
So again, this is the protest that happened after the vicious beating of Gordon Yellow Thunder, remember, in Nebraska, in Omaha, who was beaten on the street, then taken into a Veterans of Foreign War building and beaten more, and then left to freeze to death. So there was a response to that by the community, and there were some demands that they extracted as a result of, again, one example of many of these just unchecked murders, vicious, intentional killing of people simply because they are native Turtle Islanders.
In Buffalo Gap, South Dakota, Harold Schmidt killed Wesley Badhart Bull. Prosecutors charged Schmidt with involuntary manslaughter.
Again, manslaughter.
In Custer, South Dakota, AIM members protested, and the courthouse and Chamber of Commerce burned to the ground. After that, the U.S. government viewed the AIM as a militant group and increased surveillance of its activities. On the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, Oglala Sioux leaders requested the assistance of AIM in order to provide strength in their opposition to tribal President Richard Wilson, elected in 1972. Opponents of Wilson accused him of mishandling tribal funds, misusing authority, and disregarding rules of the tribal.
He was also a part of an organization that was extremely white supremacist, obviously very racist against other Sioux and other Native Americans. And so he was very co-opted, even though he was a pretty brown-skinned Sioux himself. And so, again, very much internalizing of white supremacy and internalizing of anti-Native, anti-Indigenous racism and violence, and really cannibalizing and parasitically mishandling funds and mistreating the people on the reservation who he had been elected to actually represent. And he actually created his own squad of other Oglala Sioux who are very violent, again, against their own people, called the Goons. So it's again, it's the ideology, it's the colonizing of the mind that is always the most insidious and the most dangerous, actually, of whoever subscribes to this kind of violence and systemic oppression.
Council. After a failed impeachment, the U.S. Department of Justice sent out 50 U.S. Marshals to the Pine Ridge Reservation to be available in the case of a civil disturbance. The takeover begins. On February 27th,
So again, they were going through the mechanisms, the channels, that the way the system was set up to impeach this man, and he refused to leave. So impeachment is on the table, always on the table. So February 27th is again the takeover at Wounded Knee, as well as it is about that full circle for the ancestors and why they chose Wounded Knee, because Pine Ridge, it's also because of now we're less than 100 years removed from that, nearly 100 years, and we're seeing how the whole way that the system and the apparatus has been established, even on the reservations, even by those who are supposed to represent them, who are from their own community, who are also agents, right, for the U.S. government, for colonizers. And so it's twofold. It's to push back against the system after accessing the channels and the processes that were supposed to be in place, like impeachment, to remove someone like Richard Wilson, and also to commemorate and to celebrate and honor their ancestors who had been massacred less than 100 years prior to standoff at Wounded Knee. So there's massacre at Wounded Knee in the 1800s, and then there's standoff at Wounded Knee, or takeover, that begins February 27th, and I believe 1973. Let's see the year.
1973, about 200 AIM members came to the village of Wounded Knee and took over the trading post, museum, gas station, and several churches. Those involved in the takeover considered Wounded Knee of historical significance because of the 1890 massacre that occurred at the spot. In 1890, the U.S. Army killed 250 to 300 Lakota Sioux, with 25 Army casualties. The goals set by AIM leaders were support for the reformation of tribal government, as well as bringing attention to the injustices done to Native American people. Russell Means, as an AIM spokesperson, requested congressional investigations into conditions on all reservations and the corruption of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Means specifically wanted a hearing to take place concerning treaties and treaty rights. News of the takeover reached U.S. Marshals at Pine Ridge, and they placed roadblocks at all entrances to Wounded Knee to prevent access to the area.
Now, this is supposed to be sovereign native land. U.S. reservations they're not a part of the United States. They are sovereign, and they're federally recognized to the descendants of those who are ancestral to the land. The problem is it's a hybrid model where all of these so-called sovereign nations, which are reservations, federally recognized, ultimately the U.S. federal government has the final say and oversight. So that's what the Bureau of Indian Affairs was set up to do. And so it's very corrupt. It's very contradictory in terms. And this is an example of overriding, like, where the illusion or the kind of pretense of, well, you've got some sovereignty, right, of the U.S. government, federal, having to be, that's why the FBI got involved, because reservations are technically not a part of the U.S. They are sovereign nations within the U.S., except they're not really fully sovereign.
U.S. Marshals and FBI agents set a total of 6 roadblocks, along with 5 observation points throughout the occupation to keep people from entering or leaving Wounded Knee. However, AIM and supporters entered the area by overland routes, bringing in supplies. Law enforcement groups consisted of the U.S. Marshals Service, the FBI, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Start of the Troubles. After the takeover, sporadic gunfire between U.S. forces and the AIM marked the first days of the occupation. AIM forces fortified the area by building trenches, 9 bunkers, setting up roadblocks, and establishing foot patrols. The natives also relied on combat experience from Vietnam veterans in their ranks. The AIM stated that the occupation would end if requests were considered, and a meeting took place to discuss injustices done to Native Americans. Senators James Oberesk and George McGovern, alongside 2 aides from Senator Ted Kennedy's office, arrived on March 1st. They agreed to congressional committee hearings and BIA officers to be transferred. Officials decided to continue roadblocks to limit entrance into the area. AIM leaders made a statement on March 4th, declaring they would leave Wounded Knee if the U.S. government left and allowed the Lakota to work out the conflict amongst themselves. Ralph Erickson, special assistant to the Attorney General, countered this proposal by stating that if the occupiers would leave Wounded Knee by March 8th, abandon weapons, and identify themselves, they would not be subject to immediate arrest. Richard Wilson organized a special police force that became known as the Goon Squad. Wilson and his forces participated in gunfire exchanges on several occasions. By March 8th, both sides rejected negotiations. After that, the government removed the roadblocks, thinking the Lakota would disperse given the chance not to be arrested. Contrary to that, the AIM saw this as a victory, and more supporters entered Wounded Knee, bringing supplies and food. On March 11th, 4 postal inspectors entered the village to inspect postal property. The AIM took them hostage, thinking they were sent to gain information. After 4 hours, they were released, and the roadblocks were reinstalled. On the same day, the Lakota announced the creation of the Independent Oglala Nation, or ION. The ION established a provisional government and stated the return to the Treaty of 1868 as its basis. Leaders stated that the ION would negotiate with the United States, nation to nation. Their demands were now changes within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, meetings with government administrators, tribal President Richard Wilson to be removed from office, suspension of the tribal constitution, a return to government as it existed under the Indian Reorganization Act, and negotiations based on the 1868 treaty. The day after, FBI agents pursued a van that attempted to enter the village. In the pursuit, a firefight broke out, and an FBI agent took a wound to the wrist. In order to assist the AIM and the Lakota, supporters created the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee and managed to negotiate that 6 lawyers, each with a carload of food, to enter Wounded Knee each day from March 26 through March 31st. Law enforcement agreed to the deal, but Richard Wilson and his police set up the roadblocks and seized all food from the cars. Gunfire exchanges between forces occurred sporadically. Both sides established, violated, and reinstated ceasefires. AIM security, U.S. forces, and on occasion the tribal police exchanged fire. On March 26th, there was heavy firing after Wilson set up a roadblock outside the federal perimeter. During this exchange, U.S. Marshal Lloyd Grimm received a wound that paralyzed him from the waist down. By the end of April 2nd, deaths occurred. As a result of increased gunfire, Frank Clearwater and Lawrence Lamont died. Both forces established a ceasefire after that. After multiple failed negotiation attempts, leaders from the Civil Rights Division and 6 FBI agents met with AIM and Lakota leaders to discuss the misuse of tribal funds and complaints of harassment from Wilson's forces. Negotiations moved forward. On April 5th, the U.S. government and AIM leaders signed a dispossession agreement. The terms of the agreement stated that Russell Means should submit himself for arrest and be taken into custody, and on April 7th at 7 a.m., AIM leaders were to lay down their arms. A meeting would take place between AIM leaders and a representative of the White House to discuss the possibility of looking into the matter of Indian treaties. Means was arrested and, after he made bond, left for Washington, D.C. The agreement proved faulty, as Means stated that the AIM at Wounded Knee never agreed to lay down arms until the conclusion of a White House meeting. By April 24th, a negotiation team returned to Wounded Knee, led by Kent Frizzell. The U.S. government still preferred to negotiate with the AIM forces rather than resort to any aggressive attack. On May 5th, Leonard Garment, consultant to the president, sent a letter to Frank Foolscrow. The letter stated that White House representatives would meet with the Teton Sioux in order to examine the 1868 treaty. This meeting would not take place until the dispossession of Wounded Knee occurred. Both forces signed the dispossession agreement on May 5th. The agreement contained specific steps to be implemented on May 9th at 7 a.m. All persons were to leave Wounded Knee and identify themselves, and those with outstanding warrants would be arrested. Dispossession. By May 8th, half of the AIM community had left Wounded Knee. According to the timetable agreed upon, government forces entered Wounded Knee to collect all weapons and transport remaining AIM supporters to the government roadblock. Defense Committee lawyers remained at the government roadblock to witness the processing procedure. Out of the 129 people processed, 110 were Native Americans. Federal forces destroyed AIM security bunkers along with government bunkers and completed the evacuation of Wounded Knee by the end of the day. Several issues influenced the AIM decision to end the occupation, such as lack of food, electrical power, and medical supplies. The occupation had lasted 71 days. Aftermath. On July 17th, a proposal for a Senate joint resolution in order to establish an Indian Policy Review Committee was made. Its purpose included a review of the legal relationship between Native Americans and the U.S. government, and to provide support for the development of more effective policies. During 1974, Russell Means lost a campaign against Richard Wilson for the tribal president at Pine Ridge. Means was concurrently on trial in St. Paul, Minnesota, on charges from the Wounded Knee incident. The trial lasted for over 8 months and resulted in the dismissal of all charges against both Means and Dennis Banks. In the 3 years following the standoff, Pine Ridge had the highest per capita murder rate in the country, resuming a quiet war. 2 FBI agents were among the dead. Today, the Pine Ridge Reservation is the largest community in what may be the poorest county in the entire United States.
So it's those 2 FBI agents in which Leonard Peltier was falsely accused of murdering one of them. So this concludes the focus on the Red Power movement, also called the American Indian Movement, and how it did lay the foundation for so many more changes in activism that continues to the present day.